Praise be Jesus and Mary, and welcome to our weekly show that looks at all events through the Message of Fatima. Today we are pleased to interview Murray Rundus from Catholic Family News and to discuss the Catholic plan for social order. This is Fatima Today with David Rodriguez and Monique Krowecki. And today we have with us Murray Rundus, who is the managing editor and production manager for Catholic Family News, CFN. Murray, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. Fatima Center, it's Catholic Family News and Fatima Center has always had this great relationship with Father Gruner and John Venare going back all the way over there. So it's great to be on here.
Well, today what I would like to start off is talking about the conference you recently helped organize. But on that note, I also want to remind all of our viewers that the Fatima Center is hosting its conference in May 17th and 18th. It's easy to remember because it's the weekend after Mother's Day. And the theme is faith, fidelity, and your future. So that's May 17th and 18th. It is in the Cincinnati area. So if you'd be flying in, the airport code is CVG. Sometimes that confuses people because the airport is actually in northern Kentucky, Covington, that's the CVG, and the hotel is actually right next to the airport. So the airport is also in northern Kentucky. I think the town might be called Hebron, Kentucky, but it's the basic Cincinnati area. Probably easier to say that so that people have a good geographic idea of where it's going to be. We have some great speakers such as Father Michael Rodriguez and Father Matthew Benedictine, as well as Christopher Ferrara, Dr. Micah Hickson. She's writing some great work on the Rome-Fatima-Moscow connection. Mariana Bartold. I'll be speaking as well. And there's a few others, but you can check out the website. So that's fatima.org/Cincy 2025. I'm sorry, Cincy 25, I think it is. CINCI. So, enough about our conference, Murray. We're here to talk about yours. So tell us, Catholic Family News just had a conference. How did that go?
Oh, it went excellent. We saw a lot of people. Catholic Family News had to stop this because of the whole pandemic issue that happened in 2020. And we haven't had a conference really since then. And so there was a revival of this conference, and it was a major success. We saw a lot of people there. We had many priests. We had daily mass. And the talks were really, I think it's some of the best out there. I think these are going to be staple talks, staple lectures for the coming future for the traditionalist movement. So it just went excellent.
So, Murray, why was the theme selected, the Catholic Plan for Social Order, or what was the exact title?
Yeah, so the whole conference is really focusing on the works and writings of a man named Father Dennis Fahey. And just to preface it with this, some of our Irish friends will correct and say, well, it's Fahey, that's how you pronounce it. But everybody on this side of the world says Fahey, so we really stick with that. And Father Fahey, this is a conference that John Venare, the late John Venare, may he rest in peace, he always wanted to host. He used to go around giving about a 1 hour conference, and you can find that still online, really talking about the importance of Father Fahey, who wrote many books and in many ways was a precursor to the traditional Catholic movement with a lot of the ideas of Archbishop Lefebvre and the later traditionalists as well. So we really wanted to do that justice. We wanted to have a conference focused on this man because, of course, John Venare, this was always his lifelong dream that he could never see put into action, but also because we think this is so important really for the traditionalist movement as a whole.
If I could just add in there, Maria, maybe just to clarify, I would say that this really is important for recovering, restoring our Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think some of the individuals you mentioned, but we could throw in others like Pope St. Pius X, certainly to some extent Archbishop Fulton Sheen, but there was certainly a big effort in the early part of the 20th century to identify and recognize the modernist heresy and all the different ways that it was infiltrating certainly into society, but also the church. And so, yes, Father Fahey was very interested in that. I'm grateful to, again, as you mentioned him, John, seminary, because I would not have known about Father Fahey except for these talks that he would always give. It's like John was always mentioning him. And so, of course, that made me go and get some books on him and start reading on him. And yes, he's a great thinker. The more you learn about him, the more you realize how important he was, especially in that first half of the 20th century, like along with Garrigou-Lagrange and others. Anyway, so I did want to mention that part, just to clarify sort of like where just to clarify what you had mentioned on that point. Monique, you were going to ask, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that to be honest with you, I'd heard of Father Fahey, but I hadn't really read any of his materials. And so when Catholic Family News announced their conference, I read the articles that were in the November 2024 issue and the February 2025 issue. And I really gleaned a lot. And I was really impressed, actually, that Father Fahey actually put together this 6-point plan for social order based on the papal encyclicals for the program of Christ the King. And I think that it's really timely because this year, on December 11th, it's the 100th anniversary of Quas Primus, right? Which is the papal encyclical on Christ the King. So I think that is, or the kingship of Christ, I should say. So I thought that was very timely. And I even watched some of the videos from the conference this past weekend on Locals. So that gave me an insight. And now I'm actually, very, I guess, enthusiastic to want to get all of his works.
Yeah, it's really, he has such a good amount of works. He covers such a large amount of things. But as you mentioned, it really does boil down to 6 points. And he thought it was really important to put it into those 6 points. And we really did follow that at the conference. And if I could, David and Monique, if I could list those 6 points for you all, maybe we can get into some of those. I think that's helpful here. Yeah. The first point he has, and this is something that I think all traditional Catholics are all aware of, and this is something that's been a priority for us, but it's recognizing that the church is supernatural and also supranational. And that means that not only is the Catholic Church above the natural level, we're not just dealing with some human institution as we deal with the state, but we're dealing with something established by Jesus Christ, God himself. And in addition to that, when we say supranational, we're meaning that it's above every state. So we're not adopting an error as we see with some of the Eastern schismatics with associating the church and the state so closely that it's not above any state. Or for example, with the initial Anglican heresy of Henry VIII, associating the church, the head of the church, with the leader of the state. And leading from that first point is that nations have an obligation to recognize Christ the King, as you just mentioned, and recognize the church, because this serves as the foundation for social order. And so that when we talk about the traditionalist movement today, when we talk about, as people sometimes mock, the Fatimists of today, well, what is often one of the big things that we're promoting? Well, it's this era of religious liberty that has come about, that every man has a right to worship in whatever religion that he wants. This is, of course, one of the errors of Russia, saying that either saying that on a naturalistic level, man has no obligation to worship Christ, or the state doesn't have an obligation to acknowledge Christ the King, or saying that, well, it's just as good if you're worshiping in a Buddhist religion or the Catholic one. And so those first 2 points are super important. I don't know if you two have anything to add on those two. I think there's a lot that's covered there, of course.
There is a lot to say. One thing I'll just mention, as you were speaking about the supranational nature of the church, I thought that it is unfortunate that when a lot of these groups, like the Anglicans, or certainly all the different Lutherans that were splitting up in the Protestant Revolution, right? Obviously, much of this was motivated less by doctrine and more by power grab and money. And that's what a lot of the Protestant leaders, political leaders, wanted. But when you make your church so exclusively identified with the state, you lose a lot of the missionary zeal and impetus. Right, so we're going back to the great mandatum that our Lord gives us in Matthew 28, where he says, go and baptize all nations, make disciples of them all, teaching them all that I've commanded you. And yet, when you sort of say, well, this is the church that's the English church, or this is the Prussian church, or when you start making it like that, well, then it really, you undercut your own missionary efforts, which has in fact happened a lot, even with a lot of the Eastern churches, right? Once they sort of nationalize and identify themselves more nationally, it's much harder to become evangelistic because you're not Catholic, you're not universal, you're not going everywhere. So I think that's also part of the way that Christ's kingship over all nations is being denied. And we've seen that too, as you said, with the religious indifference, right? That goes right hand in hand. I mean, if we're going to be religious indifferent, why have a missionary zeal? So this is one of the great things that affects us and hurts us. And of course, with the Fatima message, we're always trying to promote it. We got to be little apostles for Our Lady, taking her message everywhere in her rosary, the brown scapular, and all those things.
Yeah, and I just think about the church or sorry, not the church, but China wanting to try to nationalize the Catholic Church with their Chinese Patriotic Catholic Church, which is not, really the way that the Catholic Church has always been. The true Catholics, are the underground Catholics in China. And I think of Cardinal Zen, and I think of all of the persecuted Catholics. But then the Chinese government has tried to, have their own state church where, all the bishops there basically swear allegiance to the country first. And that's totally against what the Catholic Church has ever done.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing because there's two errors that the Catholic has to really fight. Because the firstly, we're dealing with this error of communism, which is of course this excess of wanting equality, right? Of course, we had in the French Revolution, it was liberty, equality, and fraternity. Well, the primary error that's being promoted with communism is this idea of equality. We're going to make this Marxist state, and at the same time, we also have to realize that we have this danger of liberalism. And this is something at the forefront in China today, because people don't know this today, but the above ground church, the patriotic church, they were celebrating the Latin Mass up until the 90s, while the underground church, of course, adopted the Novus Ordo. And so you have this weird dynamic that the traditional Catholic has to find himself today in, because he has to find himself between liberalism and communism. And the Catholic has to take a principled stand against both. And I think that leads us to our next point, because the Catholic he's not just dealing with an abstract thing of, we're dealing with the state, we're fighting against we're trying to make the state acknowledge Christ the King, or we're for some end that is unlikely to be achieved materially in the near future. But it also comes down to his personal level, and this is why Father Fahey on number 3, he says it's important to realize that Satan is going to attack the family, and it's going to undermine the Catholic family. It's in our name, right? Catholic Family News. And this is something that both Marxism and it's something that liberalism also do, because if you look at, we just released a conference. Mrs. Kelly Childs of St. Mary's College gave the history of feminism. And the early feminists ultimately said, we want to destroy Christian hierarchy, and we want to destroy really the Christian notion of the family. And how are they going to do this? And both the communists and the liberals do this to this day. But you saw this especially with the early communists. They're going to promote promiscuity. They're going to promote homosexuality. And they're going to destroy the Christian notions of marriage by introducing things like pornography, or just a widespread exception of things like fornication. And this has happened to this very day. We see this constantly around us. So it's important to recognize that we're not dealing with things on an abstract level, or even from a looking above to the state, trying to see what the state is doing. This attacks our own families as well, through these means of promoting all of these demonic activities.
Right, because of course we have to always acknowledge that certainly Christ is king over marriage, and then marriage is an institution that God himself created. We'll read about it in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Already there we see its first 2 ends. I think it's Genesis 1:28, where he says, be fruitful and multiply. I mean, that's the primary end. And of course, it's so that God can share his life with many, many creatures, his grace. He wants us all to share his life for all eternity. And then, of course, later on, when we hear in Genesis chapter 2 about how Adam needs a helpmate. It's not good for him to be alone. And this one is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. We see the secondary end, which always must be kept also a secondary end. And that's obviously the mutual help of the spouses and the quelling of the passions. So marriage is something God has created. We can't change it. And we see certainly that under attack in the state, in the church. Quick Fatima link. I think most of our viewers know this, but I do want to mention it, that Cardinal Caffarra, back in the 80s, when John Paul II made him the head of the new sort of Marriage and Family Institute, Pontifical Institute, he wrote to Sister Lucia requesting prayers and didn't even think he'd get a response. He just kind of wanted her to pray for him. And she wrote back and very tellingly said that the final battle that the devil will wage is precisely against marriage, and that we have to do our best to defend it, and that those who defend marriage will be under attack as well. So I think it's interesting because as you read a lot of the well-known Fatima literature that's out there and that's in print, it never explicitly mentions this sort of attack on marriage and family. You really would have to sort of read implicitly to kind of get to that in a more general and vague sense. But Sister Lucia was dead on target with this even back in the 80s. So I do believe there's something in there that, obviously there's volumes and volumes and volumes of all the Fatima research that we have yet that remain under lock and key, much like, everyone's talking right now about Epstein files and, the JFK files that are supposed to be released and they don't get released. Well, we've got our own there with the Fatima archives. But yeah, I wanted to make that connection as well to marriage and this third point that Christ is king over marriage and we must defend marriage.
Yeah, and did not Sister Lucy say, that this battle over marriage and the family was going to be the definitive battle between, the devil and Our Lady, was going to be over the family. And I think it's interesting too, when you were talking about go forth and multiply, that when I was listening to she's not a doctor, but Mrs. Kelly Childs, when I was listening to her talk, and she spoke about how Satan absolutely hates the idea that men and women can create children because they participate in God's creative power. And he could never do anything like that. And so he attacks the whole idea of having children. And you see that in our society today. Everybody's living together. Very few people are having children, or if they do, it's very limited. So definitely you can see this in society today.
Yeah, definitely. I had it's interesting you say that. I recently we posted a video that it sort of went viral of this Novus Ordo deacon dancing with a female altar server, because this is what they do now. It's crazy. And I saw a comment from somebody saying it was a young woman, and she says, I really don't think women have any place being, altar servers, but we do have a place being mothers, wives, and religious sisters, so that we can become saints. And I think people have lost this. Everybody thinks that we're trying to put our we're trying to boil down the end of our lives for, how good can we look in our profession? Can we do a great thing? Can we make a name for ourselves, as those who built the Tower of Babel said? We're going to make a name for ourselves. But they've lost the notion of how do we sanctify our souls with what God made us to be, which is to sanctify our souls to become saints. And how are people going to know this? Well, this leads us to the next point, which is it's Christian education. And this is something I think people have lost, the Christian formation, Catholic formation. You're only going to know and really be formed, as we say, formation, if you are in a Catholic environment with Catholic schooling. And the popes knew this. If you read any papal encyclical during the 19th century, they're almost always stressing the need for Catholic education and for the dangers of the public schooling. And this is something I'm a convert. It's still kind of it jabs my heart a little bit when people talk about the dangers of public schooling, because we're grown to think this is a great thing the state is doing with providing education. But why is this a bad thing? Well, there's a famous quote from Lenin who said it was something like, if you give the state a child for 4 or 8 years, it was one of the two, I'll make a Bolshevik out of him for life. And this principle goes again for both communism and liberalism. If the state gets its hands on a child or even a college student, people mature a lot slower nowadays. if they get them into this matrix, this hamster wheel of public education, instilling in them the values of Marxism, of feminism, of liberalism, they will be like that for life. And so it's important we have good Catholic schools. This is going to be undermined again and again today. We see that it's a radical notion, really, to get your kids in a Catholic school, and people say, or even homeschooling. Of course, homeschooling has even bigger. There's almost a bigger
target on its back.
Yeah, a target on its back for it. And people say, oh, you're in a cult or something like that. But in reality, it's you want to save your kid's soul. We want to make good warriors for Christ the King. And so Father Fahey knew it. Point number 4, we must have Catholic education.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll just take that back real quick to the primary ends that, I said, sort of quoting Genesis 1:28 about fruitful and multiply, but it is always important, I think, to understand that there's a purpose to that, and that is to form these children. So parents are a lot like stewards. I like to think of the parable of the talents, right? Where one got 5 talents, or the 1 talent, the 10 talents. And then what do you do with those? You come back with 20 talents when the king comes back. So we as parents, like, we're stewards of our children in that sense. Like, they're not ours. They belong to God. And we have to form them and lead them to help them achieve the perfection that God wants them to have. And then we give them back to God, right? So that on the day of judgment, when we're judged, we're primarily as parents judged on our vocation. And I can hopefully, God willing, by his grace, sort of say, well, look, here's the child you gave me, and here's how I restore him to you. You gave me these 5 talents, and I'm giving you these 5 plus 5 talents. That would be the ideal for every parent. So it's all about forming and educating your children in Christian perfection, so that they can really become those people that God wants them to be, those souls with their unique gifts and their talents, and they're all individual. And so parenting is certainly a great responsibility, but you get those graces in marriage, right, to raise those children well. And again, the sacrament of marriage being so important, because you get each man and woman who are married in the sacrament of marriage are going to get specific graces for them to meet their personality and their temperaments and their children's personality and temperaments. And that's why it's so important for parents to be very involved in the education and formation of their children, because those graces are things that no one else gets. You get them from the sacrament of marriage directly from God. So that's actually one of the reasons also I'm big on pushing and advocating for and promoting homeschooling. It's good. It's good for the family, good for the mom and the kids, and dad too.
You made a good point, though, David, because when you said that when in the sacrament of marriage, there's a lot of graces that are given for the couple and for their children. I actually heard a sermon once where a priest said that a lot of marriages have problems because they forget that their marriage is a sacrament, and they don't ask God for the graces that they need. So I think it's very important for people to ask for those graces. And also for me, like you, Murray, I didn't actually go to a Catholic school until I was in grade 4. And I was so grateful that I was able to be in this Catholic school. I remember thinking I was going down to the office one day to give a note to the principal, and I just stopped in the stairwell, and I thought, I can't believe I'm actually in a Catholic school. Like, I was so happy about it. And the ironic thing is that at that same age, I had to pull my children out of the Catholic schools because they weren't Catholic anymore, and homeschool them.
Yeah, no, I also went almost all through public education, but I have a sad story too, because we were actually living in Europe, in Germany, and then we came back to the States, and I was about to enter 5th grade. And so my parents thought that the easiest thing, and what would sort of make the transition easiest, because I've been in a German public school, would be to send me to the parochial school, the place where I was baptized, where, we went to mass every Sunday. Parish was called Blessed Sacrament. So sure enough, I got sent to Blessed Sacrament for 5th grade. And I'll tell you, it was one of my worst years. Then even when they moved me later on to the public school. But I mean, I learned so many impurities, so many bad words. It's like the faith was really lacking. I would say that I was hurt more by my 1 year there at the parochial Catholic school than even when I got into the public school. And that's a sad state of affairs. So obviously parents have to really be on the lookout for good Catholic schools. And that's why you continue, like Monique said, pray for those graces. I just made me think real quick about that article, a series of articles we're having on the Our Father, but Matthew Plez has been writing. And one of the things that came up this week was give us this day our daily bread. And that obviously implies for physical goods, but also the supernatural goods that we need, the graces that we need. That's part of like giving us our daily bread that we beg for from God in the Our Father. And so, yes, as a married couple, pray for the marriage graces that you need, both with you and your spouse and with you and your children.
Yeah, and it's something, it's one of the things that in my talk I gave, I said it's presupposed by Father Fahey. And because I hope if any young person is listening, or maybe some person that's new to the traditional movement, what I hope somebody gets is that, and will notice, is that even in this conversation we're having now, what's coming first? Well, it's the sanctification of your soul, and it's Jesus Christ, right? It's how are we relating this to the faith? And that has to come first with all of these sorts of points. We have to put it into perspective. And what I think can be lost oftentimes is you get some of these newfangled commentators who come onto the scene, and they start talking, and they realize that Catholicism is true. They'll accept the apologetic arguments for it, and they'll even take some of the more principled stands against liberalism and communism and socialism that Father Fahey might take. And they'll recognize that there's a problem with the modern world, but they don't have the full picture, because they'll just say, well, I'll just go to my local parish, my local Novus Ordo parish, or, oh, I'll just send my kids to the local Novus Ordo school. The thing that must be recognized today is that if any of these 6 points that we're talking about today is going to work, if we're going to have any kind of semblance of restoring Christ the King, it needs to be within the traditional Catholic movement. Because if we're speaking just in a realistic sense, where is the traditional spirituality found? Where is the traditional formation of children found? Where's the traditional faith found, the traditional liturgy? It's really only within the traditional Catholic movement. You can't find this in your average Novus Ordo parish. And so that's really important to keep in mind. And it's something very important to keep in mind for the last 2 points, because these get into a more complex and in some ways political, but very much so economical relationship. It's much more complex. Number 5 is that there should be a widespread distribution of private property. We don't mean that in a communistic sense, that, oh, we're the state's going to take everybody's property and then delegate who needs it based on their needs. That's not what we're saying. According to their ability, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that it is good for a Christian family, in order to attain the salvation of your soul, to be able to have the means to do that, the means of production. That means that you have a means of making money, of being able to generate what you need to live, and also to make things easier for your life. Rather, we see today, whether you're living in a more socialistic country or you're living in this liberal, crony, capitalistic world, all of the private property, it's going to the 1%, as some people call it. It's going to the top. Whether it's big corporations, the globalist corporations, NGOs, major governments, all of it is connected in this small category of people, and the average person doesn't have much of any access to a widespread distribution of private property. And last point on this, I'll touch on the 6th point, and I'll send it off to you guys. He says that there needs to be a monetary system that should facilitate the Christian family. And this is something that the editor-in-chief of Brian McCall, he mentions in his talk that's coming out soon, catholicfamilynews.locals.com. Father Fahey he presents that there should be an order to how our monetary system should work. There's the agricultural arts that come first. That's how we get our food, the things we need to live. There's the mechanical arts that makes things easier for us to live, makes it easier for us to access those agricultural arts. And number 3, and this comes last in the order of how we should prioritize it, is the arts that facilitate trade, of trading money around. And the way that Satan inverts, the way that Satan destroys the monetary system and attacks the widespread distribution of property and our monetary system, is he flips it around, and he says the most important thing is that we're going to make money out of nothing. As Brian McCall says, we're going to do what the old some of the old mystics tried to do, making gold out of nothing. We're going to transform something into gold. We're going to just start printing money like crazy, and devaluing it. And then at the very last would be what you get for your food, right? I'm sure a lot of people know this. We're just going to pump things full of these ridiculous chemicals. We don't even know what we're feeding our people nowadays. We have such terrible health in our country. And so that's how Satan's going to attack it. And so we see how people used to ask John Venari, why are you talking about economics at a Catholic conference? Well, it's because all these things are related to the same thing. Christ the King is operating in every facet of our lives, and that includes our economic activity.
Oh, that's very good. I just wanted to say, Marie, I mean, these principles that you're setting out, this plan and everything, that it's fantastic. And I never thought about it before, but I'm certainly living the effects of it because, I mean, inflation is out of control, and the ability for a young person to buy their own home now is shrinking constantly. I mean, I look at my own children and I look at the prices of homes here in Canada and how much we are taxed. And I know that our federal government keeps wanting to bring in this inheritance tax. So, you're going to get less and less. Each generation will get less and less and less until, everybody, like you said, the 1% owns everything and nobody else is able to own anything else. And then, of course, that also affects the social order because so many young people who, even if they are trying to be good Catholics, using NFP and things like that because they really feel that they cannot afford to raise a lot of children in this economic climate, which really goes back to hurting the family.
Yeah. It's something that affects young people significantly. We had a lot of questions at the conference. People would come up to me and say, because we had a lot of young people that showed up to the conference. It was very interesting, and people came up to me and said, I just don't see a way I could ever buy a house in this. It's becoming impossible. And how could I raise a family if to get an apartment in a major city where I have my job? It's $6,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment,
Yeah.
and that's not even buying a house. It's
Yeah.
just never on. It's never in the cards. You're never going to be able to ever buy a house. You're going to own nothing, and you will be happy,
Yes,
as
exactly.
it often goes. So yeah, it's definitely a problem that young people are experiencing today, really more than anybody else.
Mhm.
I just wanted to link Father Fahey's structure that you gave us, those three orders, back again to the first few chapters of Genesis. Because if we recall, when God creates Adam, he does command him to dress and keep the garden. He's placed in this garden of pleasure, this paradise of pleasure. And of course, he may eat of all the fruit of all the trees, except obviously the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But there you already see the need for, if you will, the agriculture. He has to keep the garden. There's a certain amount of work in a sense that Adam already does have to do by keeping, by guarding the to dressing the garden. But then, of course, it's not until after the fall that now he has to till the soil, and it's going to be thorn and thistles. So this is where the pain comes in. But you sort of see the manufacturing arts come into play there, and you see that order. I would even say, this is stretching it now. This is me just stretching it to try to make the connection where we know that Adam and Eve make their first clothing out of fig leaves or big leaves, plant leaves, if you will. And then when our Lord casts them out, he in effect trades with them, takes those from them and gives them animal skins. Now, the important thing I think there is the fact that this is the first time an animal is clearly killed to get his skin, which introduces, of course, the concept of the animal sacrifice that God is teaching Adam. But also, you see a kind of exchange there between God and Adam, where God is giving him something better. So you could kind of nestle trade in there, but again, it comes at the very end. So I do see all of that already in the first few chapters of Genesis.
Yeah, I don't think we should feel bad for relating all these things to Genesis. In many ways, I think we can relate. It's so much of it goes back to Genesis. One of the points that I think is important for us to get is, when Cain either gets sent out and we see these first cities pop up, this is the work of man, right? That's being established. And we saw this with the Tower of Babel, as I mentioned earlier in this show. There is this tendency of man to try to bring God down to himself. We see this with, for example, with transhumanists today. This idea that we're going to make man live forever. We're going to have AI be this like pseudo God that will answer all of our problems for us today. All of these things, Father Fahey really saw coming down the pipeline. That when man starts making everything about himself, he makes a naturalistic society. He's going to man's going to have to serve somebody, as the song goes, right? And what that will end up doing is he'll try to fabricate his own God. And so, if people really want to get a solid foundation in the works of Father Fahey. Of course, go watch our conferences. But I would also say to read really two books to go along with it. There's two that I really have to recommend. The greatest of his works is this one right here. It's The Kingship of Christ and Organized Naturalism. We have a lot of people that quote this throughout our conference. This is a great book. He lays out really the entire problem there. Another one that I think is really key to understand, and a lot of people get onto this book. They'll say, "Oh, that's his one of his most controversial ones." But really, in this, I don't think it's even that controversial in the scheme of how he attacks some of the excesses and defects. But it's the rulers of Russia, and this is something so important for the Fatima message of today, right? Is how did the devil use these certain men, use the Bolsheviks to spread the errors of Russia? And he does this through international finance, through the various false religions such as Judaism, but also through confused ideas fighting against liberal capitalism. And so all of these things have to be put into perspective and into the greater perspective of what's the plan for Christ the King today. And I think the Fatima message is a huge part of that, right? Our spirituality has to come first. We should be fighting the plan of the devil with the plan of Christ the King, with the plan of Our Lady. And the way we're going to do that is by sanctifying our souls, praying the rosary every day, making the good the first 5 Saturdays, right? That's how we do this. That's how we attack the devil. That's how we get the plan for Christ the King.
Well, I just want to mention one term that hasn't come up, but I'm sure it's all over the conference talks, which I have not yet gotten to see. And that's a term that I hope all Catholics are familiar with, and we can sort of brand it about with frequency and with ease and comfort, and that's subsidiarity. So subsidiarity is this very Catholic principle that is basically saying the smallest unit of society that can effectively handle whatever task it is, whatever duty it is, it's their responsibility to do it. And they should both have the responsibility and the power to do it, to carry it out. Because what happens very often is higher ups, higher levels of society, be it a village or a state, a city, a state, or the national federal government, begins to grab power and take various responsibilities from the lower groups. And the further you get away from the smallest unit of society that can handle it, it never comes out well. It's not how God designed these things to work. And so when you were talking about like the widespread ownership of property, private property, right away, private property, it's like communism. But I was thinking very much the idea that, yes, that's subsidiarity, right? The more that people can have, like you said, like your land or your means of production, your work, St. Joseph and his, tradesman and building his craft as a carpenter, etc. The more that is widespread, the stronger your society will be, because ultimately the stronger your marriage and family are. And that's the basic unit building block, even with education. Subsidiarity, again, the lowest level that can handle it is the group that should. If a married couple can't, they don't want to homeschool, they're not able to, well then, you have a smaller group, it might be a local grouping of people or a local parish or things like that gets together and forms that. But that's a very important principle that affects all these things. Even the Message of Fatima. I mean, even in the Message of Fatima and the way Our Lady gives it, which we just talked about, there's a principle of subsidiarity. So there are things that I can do, or my family, like the daily rosary. I wear the brown scapular, right? I offer my prayer and penances. So that's subsidiarity, like at the local level. And then you got like the parish level, which is obviously now bigger, but that's why Our Lady says, I want the first Saturday devotion, right? We can't accomplish that first Saturday devotion without the help of the parish priest. And really, it'd be better if you had the support of the bishop, and the bishop was promoting it. But so you could say a parish / diocesan level. Now you've got the first Saturday devotion. And because of that, it brings in like much, much more grace. If all the little things I'm doing are little pebbles, the first Saturday, the big boulders that the catapults and the trebuchets can throw at the enemy. And then you've got, of course, the really big one, which is the one that only the Pope and the bishops can do in union with him. And that's the consecration of Russia. So again, you see this wonderful level of subsidiarity in the grace flowing through the Message of Fatima, but all levels have to be obeyed. Right, that's how subsidiary works also. So I just kind of saw that connection with all these principles that Father Fahey is teaching. And even just in a very practical way, I mean, if people want to get involved, like I think that's very important. We get involved at the local level, right? Get involved in the school boards, get involved in your local libraries and the committees that are figuring out what books are going to come or what shows can be had in the library or not. I mean, we do have to get involved, take over the local, Democratic committee or Republican committee and elect officials that'll do good things and that will promote the social kingship of Jesus Christ, our King and Lord.
No, I think what's very important you're entirely right. Subsidiarity is really a driving force when it comes to Father Fahey's message, and something I think is presupposed in the message of subsidiarity is that, and this is something that should be obvious to everybody, but it's not today. But if you're going to have subsidiarity work, you need to take your own side. And I don't mean that in some sort of prideful sense where you're going to try to, to the disadvantage of everybody else, gain material wealth or something. I don't mean that. I mean, we should be looking either as a corporate entity or as a person. You should be trying to save your soul and achieve your final end. Or achieve the common good if you're the state. The problem today that we have is that the Catholic Church does not take its own side. It seeks more to please false religions. It seeks more to gain the mass appeal of the world or these massive NGOs or groups like the UN, rather than taking the side of the Catholic faithful. And the way this gets fixed is, firstly, we have to take our own side. And that means we get involved in the traditional spirituality. We get involved in sanctifying our own soul. But then that means we work in concentric circles through the principle of subsidiarity. As you mentioned, we're going to the corporate entities that we're able to affect. So we're going to our schools. We're going to even in our company lives. If we're working for a company in our workforce, we're going to our local government, and we're making it so it takes the side of its own people. The problem we have today, and we mentioned this a lot, and Father Fahey talks a lot about this, is the problem of foreign influence. And that means either the foreign influence of the devil through the foreign influence of false religions, or foreign influence with foreign countries. And we see that in the state today.
Mm.
And this is a problem we face time and time again. Politicians are paid off. Churchmen are more concerned with pleasing false religions or gaining money from foreign entities. This is the problem that we're facing today. So subsidiarity, it's absolutely important. But the first thing that really starts with that is, are we actually taking our own side, or are we seeking to take somebody else's side that goes against our true interest of saving our souls and promoting the common good?
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
Well, I was going to say, I also see the foreign influence of the world. And by
Right.
this, I mean that we as baptized Christians, going back to like St. Augustine, city of God, city of man, we as baptized Christians are ultimately meant for eternal life and should be citizens of heaven. And of course, that means being a citizen of the church here on earth so that we can be a member of the church triumphant in heaven. And that's like our real citizenship. But we have a foreign influence of the world, which is, of course, under the prince of darkness. He's the prince of this sort of the negative part of the world. And so there's a lot of that influence in the church, right? So I don't think I have time to get into that, because I think that Father Fahey, I'm not sure how much he was seeing. Well, I mean, we were certainly seeing the influences in the church, but I think we've really seen Father Fahey saw the denial of Christ's kingship by many of these states and in much of the political sphere, and you could say the secular world, and in Russia, these things. But what I've seen now in my own lifetime is really the denial of Christ's kingship within his very own church, right?
Mm.
Within that. And that's, I think, a whole nother topic that maybe we can talk to and apply Father Fahey's principles to, in a future episode. I think that it warrants it. It's so important. Monique, what were you going to, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to get back to naturalism a little bit, where you can see that in society, because so many people are atheists now, or agnostics. They only see the natural world. They only relate to things that they can identify with their senses. And so even in our country, when like the COVID lockdowns happened and all kinds of other things happened, there's a lot of people saying, oh, we have to get back to God, which is nice, but they don't have that whole picture of definitely they don't have this 6-point plan in mind. They don't really know how to do it. And I find that a lot of the people who spoke up and said, we need to get back to God, it's more of a Protestant mindset, and I think that if this plan could be well known by the citizens of each country, I think that they would see the logic of it, because maybe they wouldn't have seen it 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. But now that we're seeing the consequences of all these principles, I think people will be more receptive to actually understanding this plan.
No, definitely. It's something that we have to. I think if as you mentioned, every country really understood the 6 point plan, they'd be good to go. If our churchmen understood the 6 point plan, that would be even better. And
Mhm.
David, you mentioned how did we see this foreign influence enter the Catholic Church? Something Father Fahey did understand. I don't think he thought it would. I don't think he thought what Vatican II would have brought around would have been even possible. Fortunately for him, he died before the Second Vatican Council was commenced. But he did have a great understanding of something which Catholic Family News has been promoting for a long time, which is the Freemasonic plan called the Permanent Instruction of the
Mm.
Alta Vendita. This is something, and Fatima Center obviously has been promoting this a lot as well, which is this plan to infiltrate the Catholic Church and make it so that the churchmen may not even be card carrying Freemasons themselves. It's sort of like a conspiratorial. They're in like a cabal of Freemasons. Rather, they're promoting the message of Freemasonry, and they don't even have to be a card carrying Freemason. That's the ultimate plan of the Alta Vendita, and I think it's worked to this very day. We see this stuff coming out of the Catholic Church, which is why it's important that we have a coherent message for the future. We're solid on politics. We know how we can make our states more oriented towards the common good and Christ the King. But really, what needs to be done first is we restore the church. And we do that in our own lives. We restore our own souls, but we're also restoring it. If we're going to a traditional parish, we're making sure that we're staying on the straight and narrow, if you will. We're making sure it's a loving community. We're making sure that it's a strong community, and that we're bringing people to the traditional Latin Mass. And that's all we can do. At the on that sort of level. Of course, we want to promote vocations. We want to make the traditional movement grow, and that should be the focus. We need to have a coherent message that involves being solid on church issues and recognizing the crisis in the church, doing the best we can there, but also the state, making sure we're restoring Christ the King as king of our earthly societies.
That's very well said, Marie. And I have to say, I've been very blessed to be able to go to a traditional parish that actually had a school. So I did homeschool, but I also sent my children to a traditional school. And I have to say, for my education, that was steeped in religious indifferentism in the Catholic school,
Mm-hmm.
going to a traditional parish and having the education, the catechism classes, and also I'm a voracious reader, so that helped as well. But definitely, it's going to those traditional churches if you can, and getting traditional catechism, traditional sacraments, understanding the Christ of the church. That is so important. The only thing that I would say, I watched what happened with the Society of St. Pius X, and they had those doctrinal conferences with the Vatican, and ultimately nothing really came about it because each side is entrenched in their own position. And I just think that all the work that these hardworking traditional priests are doing, and even what the Fatima Center is doing, all of these good works are wonderful. But ultimately, Our Lady of Fatima said that only I can help you. And I truly believe that there needs to be emphasis as well on the message of Fatima with that
Mm-hmm.
consecration, praying for that consecration. Because when the consecration happens, all of those obstacles and stumbling blocks that the traditional movement is trying to get past in order to get the church authorities to see, all of that will be taken away when we finally obey Our Lady.
Yeah,
Mm.
you're definitely right, Monique. And I think one of the key things there is that I think every Catholic of goodwill and of good heart can rally around our most blessed mother. Right, that's why she's the mother, and so we can all rally around her and her message. And regardless of what differences there may exist at other levels, that unity of the Catholic faith is really going to be fostered by Jesus Christ and His mother. Uh,
Definitely.
really quick, want to just recap the 6 points in case people did miss them. So, just the 6 points of this plan. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, Murray, but I would say that our Lord established the Catholic Church as a supernatural and supranational institution. Number 2 would be the indirect power of the true church. Number 3, the indissolubility and unity of marriage. Number 4, the education of children, again, as members of the mystical body of Christ. Number 5, the wide diffusion of private property. And then number 6, the proper hierarchy of the trades, agriculture, the mechanical, and then trading.
Right.
Okay.
That's 100% right, and we cover it all in our conferences. And there's so much that is, as I've been speaking about. There's so much there that Father Fahey really does presuppose, because he's steeped in the traditional spirituality of the church, and so obviously that has to come first, and we have to really study the ground there first. But yes, we talk about Father Fahey's life, we talk about these 6-point plans, and we talk about how the traditional spirituality and the traditional faith is the way that we can actually implement this plan for society.
So again, if people want to watch these conferences, where is it they can do that?
CatholicFamilyNews.locals.com.
Okay. And since it went well, any plans to have another conference next year?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we're pretty exhausted from this one, but I'm sure we've got to keep this going now. It's the Catholic Family News Conference is revived, and so we plan to keep doing this for many years to come.
Fantastic. Any final words? Any last thing that you haven't mentioned yet that really impressed you at the conference, or?
I'm impressed by really how just the wide range of people that the traditional movement really encompasses. And I would say, just as 2 quick things, it's very important that the young people of today recognize that there's so many people that came before them. We, of course, had the passing of Dr. David Allen White, Bishop Williamson, Bishop Tissier. These men laid the groundwork so that we can have the traditional movement that we have today, Archbishop Lefebvre. And it's to really, we need to be thankful for those pioneers of the traditional movement by praying for their souls, and also by carrying the message forward. And final thing I'll say, pray the rosary every day. People need to have this hammered into their head. It's something we as Catholics need to be doing. Pray the rosary every day.
Well, that's it for Fatima today. Murray, thank you so much for joining us. We do hope to have you again in the future sometime, maybe the very near future. Please, viewers, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. That's a good way to evangelize, to share the message of Fatima with others, and of course, also the divine plan of Christ's social kingship.
And remember, Our Lady of Fatima has given us the only solution for the problems of our times. God bless you, everyone.
Our Lady of Fatima, pray for us.
Pray for us.
Thank you, Murray.